I'm delighted to welcome you to another CERL book talk. My name is Claire Finkelstein, and I'm the founder and director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. CERL is a nonpartisan, interdisciplinary institute dedicated to the preservation and promotion of the rule of law in 21st century national security and public policy. The only center of its kind housed within a law school, CERL draws from the study of law, philosophy, and ethics to answer the difficult questions that arise at the intersection of national security issues, public policy, and jurisprudence. CERL holds two major roundtable working group conferences a year, as well as several one-day events and book talks, delivers briefing papers, and has a book series with Oxford University Press, as well as other initiatives. We conduct military briefings on ethics and legal-related matters of current relevance and consult widely on national security matters. We work with public servants, members of the armed forces, policymakers, industry leaders, veterans, and veteran support groups, in addition to academics drawn from a variety of disciplines, to discuss and make progress on the pressing ethical issues of our day, with a particular focus on issues in national security. Last spring, in April, we held a conference on interference with democratic institutions featuring General Michael Hayden, as well as a number of impressive journalists and other commentators. Fortunately for us, Luke Harding was able to participate in that event, and I'm pleased to say that our invitation to Luke on that occasion actually helped to produce the impressive work that we'll be discussing today. Little did I know. Luke was very quiet at the time and mentioned nothing about the fact that he was working on this book. So why did I invite him? I invited him because I saw that he had been Moscow bureau chief for the Times for a while.
Guardian.
For the Guardian, excuse me, for the Guardian. And I figured on a flyer that he'd be rather knowledgeable about the topic of Russian interference in democratic institutions. Indeed, he proved extremely knowledgeable. So when I saw this book, Collusion, appear, I was rather thrilled and particularly proud of having identified Luke as someone important to talk to at the time in April. I learned today that he had, a number of the questions that he had asked General Hayden and conversations that they had had actually helped him in his current work. And I was pleased that we were able to contribute to this important product. As you may know, Luke's book Collusion has been #1 on the New York Times bestseller, and with each passing day it continues to be more and more relevant as events unfold. Lauren Make is politics reporter with NBC 10 here in Philadelphia. She worked previously at NBC in Tampa, Florida, and covered the 2016 campaign here in Philadelphia. She was previously a print journalist working for the Inquirer and other places. We're absolutely delighted to have Lauren here. And my colleague Mitch Orenstein here at University of Pennsylvania is professor and chair of Russian and East European Studies. He is also associate of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. His published works are numerous, extremely impressive, and very relevant to current events. He writes on political economy and international affairs of Central and Eastern Europe. His first book was titled Out of the Red, Building Capitalism and Democracy in Post-Communist Europe. And it won the 1997 Gabriel Almond Award of the American Political Science Association. So we're absolutely delighted to have all three speakers, and I turn it now over to Lauren Make.
So much. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you all very much for joining us, and you'll have an opportunity to ask some of your own questions when we get through mine.
Bring it on.
Yeah. Luke, let's start sort of where Claire was talking about right here at Penn, because you were writing the book while you were here. Tell us a little bit about how this book came about and why you were being so secretive about it.
Yeah, well, first of all, hello, very nice to see everybody here. It's great to be back. The genesis of the book essentially was meeting Christopher Steele. So I met him with a colleague in December of 2016. This is at a time before he became world famous, and we knew he was a former British intelligence officer. We knew that he specialized in Russia, and I had been investigating Donald Trump, by this point president-elect, in connection with Paul Manafort, whom I knew, money, various other sort of threads that we were trying to kind of pull at. And I went to go and see sort of Christopher Steele, and if and when this book is turned into a movie, you can imagine it being reconstructed, because we knocked on the door of Orbis, which is his private business intelligence operation, and we ended up in a pub, a sort of English pub called the Shakespeare, and we're talking kind of confidentially. And what was interesting about this encounter was that he didn't say anything about the dossier. He was super discreet.
How much longer was it afterwards when?
3.5 weeks. But basically, he's rather a good spy. I mean, or an ex-spy.
So he had the dossier at that point. He just didn't know it existed.
No, he had sent these memos. Okay. It's just no one had seen them. Well, actually, by this point, a few US journalists had been briefed about them, but actually they hadn't sort of seen physical copies. They'd just been told about the kind of contents. And Steele, like a kind of good intelligence operative, he basically listened. So I told him what we were doing. He didn't say a huge amount, but he essentially intimated, without articulating, that there were, first of all, that this was an extremely serious business, the US election, and that we should follow the money and follow the sex, which was, I mean, first of all, how does one follow sex? As an investigative journalist, I mean, it's quite hard to. I mean, we've all seen All the President's Men. I mean, but the sex, I was uncertain about. But essentially, what he was saying was that this is a tremendously serious subject worthy of investigation. And then BuzzFeed publishes his dossier on January the 10th. He was not thrilled about that, I can tell you. He is not greatly enjoying the kind of global attention he's getting, both positive and negative. And it seemed clear to me about 2 days later, I thought, this, I mean, I've done books on WikiLeaks. I did a book on Edward Snowden, which got 2 of my books being turned into movies. I've done Panama Papers. I've done investigations into Russian money laundering. But it seemed to me that this was really the story of our age. And I was walking up the hill to my house outside London, and I could see the sort of prologue, this meeting with Steele, by this point world famous, felt like a kind of compelling first chapter. And then I thought, well, actually, I know Paul Manafort from Ukraine, and I found my old notepad, and I looked at it, everything he told me back in 2008 had turned out to be a lie. I knew many of the Russian oligarchs who kind of thread through this story. And so by the time I got here, I'd already written about 30,000 words, and I had a book deal with Penguin Random House in New York. I hadn't told my boss. I hadn't really told anybody. I was writing this offline. Very quickly, I had about 15 publishers around the world who wanted to publish at the same time, and we were sending the stuff off by FedEx. I mean, we became our own conspiratorial sort of Leninist cell. And we would have secret meetings in Frankfurt on the margins of the book fair in London and elsewhere. Meanwhile, this crazy story was going. And in the end, when Mueller's first indictments came out, so about 4 or 5 months after I was here, I had a call from Sonny Mater, who's a famous publisher in New York, who's my publisher, who said, look, we've got to bring the book out. So I stayed up all night, rewrote the epilogue. A week later, it was in bookshelves. After 3 days, it was on the bestseller list, and after 2 days, it was number 1. So.
And that's interesting that you got that call, because one of the things I wondered as I read it was, when the book ends, you've had the indictments of Manafort and Gates and Papadopoulos, but we haven't had a guilty plea from Michael Flynn.
No.
And I wondered, how did you decide when to stop?
Basically, we thought we have to get out because the material is compelling, because we were worried about being hacked, that someone might try and leak this stuff out. I'm sure if Julian Assange could have leaked it out, he would have done. And in a way, that the kind of first Mueller indictment felt like a kind of period. It felt like a moment to stop. And I'll update the book this year and add a new chapter and probably write about the extraordinary poisoning that we've just seen in the UK in the last 2 weeks. because Vladimir Putin is still in business.
Let's talk about that a little bit since you brought it up. I know you've been spending a lot of time talking about that. Tell us a little bit about sort of how you view that in light of the other things that you have learned about Putin, and the motivations in Russia, and why, if they did this, they might have done it.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who haven't followed it very closely, that there's a former Russian intelligence officer called Sergei Skripal and his daughter, who 13 days ago were found comatose on a bench in the middle of a city in the southwest of England where nothing ever happens, Salisbury. It's the sleepiest of sleepy places. And they were poisoned with military nerve agent of a kind that was only ever manufactured by the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s with an incredibly toxic substance. And I think the British government's reacted, but I think this attack was demonstrative. It clearly was Putin. We had a very similar case, which I wrote a book about, called A Very Expensive Poison, which came out last year in the US about an earlier case of Alexander Litvinenko, who was sort of famously poisoned with a cup of tea in 2006. And we had a public inquiry which established this had been done by the FSB spy agency and probably ordered by Putin directly. And then we have the same thing again, astonishingly, 2 weeks before the Russian presidential election.
Sorry, it wasn't tea that killed him. It was polonium-239.
Yeah, but it was administered in something like this, basically. I'm not sure. Well, and I think. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but I think one thing you have to understand is that Vladimir Putin lies all the time. So when he says, we didn't do it, we had nothing to do with this, there's a kind of smirk there, formal denial, but a sort of inside the elite, everyone knows that this was a sort of Russian operation of the most kind of chilling kind. And I think the poisoning. I mean, obviously it speaks to his contempt for the UK and for the rather weak government of Theresa May, and the fact that we the British haven't really got any friends at the moment because of Brexit and so on. But essentially, I think what this poisoning was all about was sending a message to anyone inside the sort of Russian bureaucracy, oligarchs and so on, but also people inside Russia's own spy agencies, that if they cooperate with the West in general, but in particular with Western intelligence and indeed with Robert Mueller, then they can expect the same thing, that you may feel you're safe if you live abroad, but we will strike you down, and we will strike down your family. Because the operation in 2016 to help Donald Trump, and I think all US intelligence agencies now accept that was the goal of Russian espionage, even if Trump doesn't himself, was huge. It was big, it was covert, and there were many people inside Russia who were involved to some degree, whether it was hacking emails or whether it was career intelligence officers, whether it was people in the structure of command. And they would, you would look at the Skripal case and you would think, how unhappy I am with this regime, or how much I would quite like to go and live somewhere else. The price is enormous, and it's to do with fear, actually. It's to do with fear as an instrument of control, and Putin is very good at that.
And Mitch, this puts the U.S. In an interesting position now, both in how it has responded and also because we are between secretaries of state. So how then does this event, how Britain has responded, how the U.S. has responded, and what the international responses could be, how does this sort of shake things up on a worldwide scale?
That's it's an interesting question. We're in between secretaries of state, yes. We're also in between foreign policies. We don't, in my mind, one of the big problems is that Donald Trump's foreign policy, his personal foreign policy, is in fact different than anybody in his cabinet, it seems, particularly on this issue of Russia. So what we've seen, for instance, in the reaction to the Skripal case is that a lot of, Tillerson may have been fired because of it, apparently, right? Because the last thing he said before he went down was that, the United States needs to take this very seriously and react and respond. And then he was fired, and subsequently Trump threatened to fire McMaster for the same reason a couple days later, right? So you have the administration on the one hand responding vigorously, as they should, to an attack like this of a nerve agent in a NATO-friendly state, and the president sort of saying he's not really sure, doing a sort of Jeremy Corbyn, I guess, we're not really sure, who this is. Jeremy Corbyn's the Labour leader in Britain, who also, sort of made comments suggesting he didn't really know who had done this attack and wasn't horrible, and has been also accused of having pretty close ties with the Kremlin of various sorts. So I think we're in a very kind of uncertain place. Now, Trump's administration did put out statements ultimately saying that that yes, it's likely, I think he said, that Russia was to blame for this, and indicating the United States was going to work together, respond together with Britain and France to address this, but mainly just saying, look, it's the Russians who did this. But he never personally, I think to this date, hasn't ever said himself what he thinks.
But we're waiting for the tweet, because he uses Twitter sometimes, doesn't he?
Yes, I suspect that frankly, in my personal view, I think that he's made an agreement essentially with the Russians that he simply cannot make these types of public statements against Putin or the Russian government. That's how he behaves in any case.
As we look at things like this, and as we head into midterms and another presidential election, how do you think that the books like this, things like the Mueller investigation, all the people talking about this, will affect Putin and the way he does things and the way the Russians do things going forward? Do you think that they will change their tactics as a result?
They will double down. I mean, the corollary of 2016 is to do it again, do more of it, and to keep going. And also, I think what you have to understand is that a lot of this is a great global mind game. In other words, they can interfere, or they can kind of faux interfere. I mean, when we saw last time, supposedly they tried to penetrate various electoral roll boards, but didn't. But the sort of big picture is an attempt to kind of undermine Western democracy and undermine people's confidence in their own institutions. And I think it's been quite effective. I mean, what Putin is trying to. I mean, Putin doesn't believe in Western democracy at all. He doesn't believe in values. He is essentially a kind of nihilist. He's almost the sort of global nihilist in chief. And the vision of international relations that he wants is essentially a 19th century vision where you have great powers like Russia and the US that have mutually agreed spheres of influence, and they can, if they so wish, overroll smaller countries, which is what Putin's done partly in Georgia and certainly in Ukraine, where he's annexed Crimea and fomented a war in the east of the country, which I reported on in 2014. I actually watched it happening. So there is a sort of vision, but it's a kind of dark vision, and it very much involves psychology. It involves trying to affect the way you think and using sort of old-fashioned KGB methods. They're called active measures, but updated for the age of Facebook and Twitter. And I thought Mueller's most recent indictment, where he pointed the finger at 13 Russians in the infamous troll factory in St. Petersburg, was fascinating. That essentially the idea was to mess with the heads of American voters by having Russians working on US time, pretending to be US citizens, going on reconnaissance trips to America to kind of gather information, stealing US citizens' social security data, and even doing really tacky stunts that I used to see in Moscow whenever there were opposition rallies where you get something similar, but paying people to dress up as Hillary Clinton behind bars. I mean, who wrote that script? I mean, it's terrible, but the sheer audaciousness of it is extraordinary. And so there will be definitely more of that, I think, especially in the cyber realm.
When that indictment came out, that was sort of a big bomb for a lot of people.
That was the predicate crime, or part of it.
So were you, did you have the same reaction that a lot of people did when that indictment came out, or were you sort of expecting something like that?
I was sort of expecting something like that, insofar as we've written about the troll factory forever. I mean, I'm on Twitter, and every day it's like denoming the garden. You wake up, and there's a whole load of, you chuck the gnomes over the hedge the previous night, and then they've all crept back, and they're sort of peering through the window, and you have to block, 15 other sort of trolls, and they're all pretty obvious. But the thing about Mueller is that, I mean, first of all, in the UK, we would love to have a Robert Mueller. We would love to have transparency over our electoral process, and particularly Brexit, whether that was clean or not so clean. But what's interesting about these indictments, I mean, that sometimes they tell you something new. Sometimes they confirm stuff that I've written, especially about Paul Manafort, where actually I had written my Manafort chapter, the indictment came out, and all I had to do was add some numbers from the indictment because Mueller had managed to tot it all up. But the thesis that Manafort was allegedly a supremely corrupt individual was all there. But there's so much noise and cacophony in this story. There's so much adversarialism. And you see Mueller, and you have cool, clinical, evidential, legal prose, and I mean, I think he's doing a tremendous service.
So then let's look at sort of where we started with the Steele dossier.
Yeah.
What is your sense? I mean, even Steele himself has said that it is not 100% accurate. This is information that he got from sources. What is your sense of how much can be or has been corroborated, and which parts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so Steele's own view is that his dossier is between 70 and 90% accurate, and I've had conversations with people very close to him, and you have to ask the question, well, how do you know that you weren't fed misinformation, that you weren't sort of played in some way by the Russians to put all this stuff out, which would then discredit Donald Trump?
Which sort of would that be a full circle?
Yeah, and what Steele says, I mean, he says various things. One, he's been working on this for 30 years, so 22 years as an intelligence officer. He spent 3 years in Moscow. He arrived in the Soviet Union. He at a time of thaw. He was the sort of famous image of Boris Yeltsin standing on the tank when the KGB tried to seize power in the summer of '91. You had Yeltsin, you had the tank, you had the press. And about 50 yards behind that, you had Steele, who was there and who was watching and reporting back. And then subsequently, after he left Moscow, by that point it was the Russian Federation, he kept working on Russia and was essentially the head of the Russian desk for MI6 and for the Litvinenko case, which he investigated. So he has a track record, and he says basically that whenever you get information, you use a sort of analytical toolbox. You ask whether your sources are credible, whether they might know what they're reporting in, what their track record is. And the thing is about Chris Steele is that his track record is very good. He's also very expensive, by the way. He's like the sort of Rolls Royce of this world. There are cheaper cars you can buy, but he is the most expensive because he was deemed to be the best with the best sources. And the thing is, when you sort of say, well, the Trump dossier, it's all fake, there's nothing there. Basically, what he says is that the sources he used, who obviously he doesn't identify, had proved reliable previously, particularly in Ukraine. He did a whole series of reports on the war in Ukraine, which were so good they were shared within the State Department and read by John Kerry when he was Secretary of State and others. And so the reason the FBI would meet with him when he said in the summer of 2016, look, you need to know this, there's a kind of real-life Russian espionage plot going on, was because he was deemed to be credible. And it's only latterly that there's been a real assault on his credibility. I mean,
and part of that is money related. I mean, you mentioned he's expensive, but part of the, I guess, attack on him was based on who paid for the dossier at different times.
Yeah, but the thing is, what you have to, really important point here, and again it gets lost in the noise, he didn't know who the client was to begin with. So he was just told to basically work on the question, what is Donald Trump's relationship with Russia, particularly in the field of business? So he filled this out to his chain of sources. And he didn't know what answer he was going to get. And and this was at a time before anyone was talking about Russiagate or the Kremlin or Donald Trump and Russia. It was not a theme. And paradoxically, it was quite a good time to get information because subsequently those sources kind of shut down. He said there were like lights going out. As the story blew up, his sources in Moscow went quiet. But so they were reporting back, and he basically says that the answers he was getting were hair-raising. He actually said, to read this stuff is a life-changing experience. And what's interesting is that this wasn't just Chris Steele, a sort of former senior intelligence officer. When I was sort of here last April, a meeting with Mike Hayden said, both publicly and privately, he said that he thought the Russian operation to influence 2016 sort of vote here was the greatest espionage operation of all time. This is Mike Hayden. He is no liberal, former head of CIA, former head of NSA.
And I think to understand some of the things in the dossier and to understand some of the things in the book, you sort of have to have a backdrop of understanding how things work in Russia,
Sure.
which is not the way they work here.
You can say that again.
Although increasingly, it's hard to say.
Well, yeah.
Well,
you can run with that idea.
And maybe you can help us out with that a little bit, to understand, the banking system is, is different, and just the system overall is different in terms of the intertwinings of the government with everything else, and to really understand the argument that your book makes, I think you need to understand that as well.
I would add too that for an American audience, what's really interesting is that you can't presume much knowledge of the inside workings of just how Russia works, for an American audience in general, like especially a general public audience. So when these issues were raised during the campaign, I think for most Americans it just seemed very, very vague and abstract and strange, essentially.
What do you think would help to bring it home? I mean, what do people not understand?
I think truthfully, I think what people don't understand about Putin is the fact that the regime kind of works like a mafia state. I think you actually
I wrote a book called
put
that
up.
Yeah.
And
my first book on
you may
Russia. It's
know
called Mafia
Valentin
State.
Magyar, right? And this was really right. So you can't look at Putin as a world leader. He may be, in my view, the richest man in the world. He may control a wealth in excess of estimates are $200 billion.
I'm now at 3.
Which is why he acts with such arrogance, I think, at times. But you really have to look at him in a sense as a sort of mafioso. He's the capo di capi, right, of this system, which is called in Russia, they have a word for it, it's called sistema, right, which is how they refer to their government, as essentially a mafia-type organization that operates according to the ethos of the Russian mob. That's, for instance, why traitors like Skripal have to die, is because in Russian mob, if you're a traitor, you're dead. And they also operate according to many of the techniques of the Russian mafia in terms of shared bank accounts, where it's kind of an odd concept, but money gets pooled and there's certain people who have access to it. That's why you see a lot of Putin lieutenants with all sorts of wealth, but actually probably Putin is controlling it ultimately. So there's to regard him, and the press has, I think, done a bad job, by the way, in the U.S. of reporting on the recent Russian election, because it's reported like, oh yeah, people went to vote and they elected Vladimir Putin, and it just sounds like the way you would report an election in any other country, but it's not an election like in any other country. One of his biggest opponents was shot to death about a year ago, Nemtsov, or a couple years ago now. And another one was jailed for the purpose of making it impossible for him to run, Viktor Navalny. There's video recorders in every single election precinct in Russia, and they recorded a lot of people stuffing ballot boxes.
So there's one other lovely detail, which is in some of them they hung party balloons over the video, so it obscured the ballot stuffing.
So things just do operate, and so one way to look at Russian foreign policy is this is a mafia organization which already controls one country and kind of wants to have business interactions with other countries and to control other countries, and they're looking to intimidate people. You might ask, why did they go after these crazy poisons? Why, they're trying to intimidate the British the British government into not reacting, right, into not taking effective action, essentially, because they'd be worried. Everybody should be worried about what the Russians are going to do to them, essentially.
Luke,
yeah.
were you concerned at all writing this book that, I mean, you had already had interactions with them, and you can get into that, but were you concerned? Were you concerned about either your safety or legal exposure, either in the U.S. or from anyone in Russia?
Yeah. Well, I sort of previously kind of consoled myself with the idea that I mean, I know how they think, having spent 4 years there, and also been rather sort of, we sort of fell into the mincer, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But there's a sort of, Mitch is right, there's a sort of rule for Russians, there's a rule for foreigners. I mean, first of all, the assumption inside the KGB, the FSB spy agency, which is the successor agency, which Putin ran before he became prime minister and president, is that all Western diplomats are spies, but also all American and British journalists are spies as well, that we're all spies.
And probably
basically.
professors too, by the way.
Professors,
Yeah.
yeah, you're kind of shabby spies or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah. And I mean, it's a sort of ridiculous fantasy. I mean, I was a shabby journalist when I was there. I didn't have a car, you know, let alone an Aston Martin. You know, I took my kids to school on the tram. But the reason I tell you that is so there's a rule for spies, which is that you can hound them, harass them, entrap them, blackmail them, and do sort of minorly nasty things to them, but you don't kill them. And there's another rule for Russians where there's a spectrum from nothing to nerve agent, basically. I think that's the end of the spectrum. What's really disturbing about the Skripal case is that he was not actually a defector. He was swapped out for the 10 Russian spies who were sleepers in America. You probably remember Anna Chapman in 2010, who was this sort of glamorous spy, and there were 9 others. And Skripal, who was a British agent, was swapped out to the UK. And therefore, under this sort of old Soviet code, that meant he should have been left alone. And the fact that he was so demonstratively assassinated, or almost assassinated, suggests to me that almost there are now no rules, and that this sort of, I mean, bear in mind that Russia it's quite similar to the Soviet Union, but it's a sort of ideologized form of the Soviet Union. I mean, there's a kind of ultra-nationalism, sort of patriotism, which is definitely a kind of theme, but there's not the sort of same kind of heavyweight Marxism that we had. And so what you're left with, as Mitch says, is a rather unpredictable gangster syndicate, almost provincial gangsters rather than the ones you see on your TV. I mean, they're an incredible bunch, and they have 2 projects. One is keeping control, and propaganda is important, and the sort of great Maximal Russia story is important. But the other private project is to steal as much money as they can, and to offshore that money, and to protect it from other people who might wish to steal it from them. And the person who guarantees this system is Putin. So Putin's kind of locked in the whole Russian elite, so that if he were to lose power, that they would lose their billions, and that's why he's just become president again for another 6 years, and I think he will be president for 6,000 years.
Can I just add to one thing to that? So in the underworld, ethos in Russia, enemies are sort of respected. They're respected a lot more than traitors. So Luke would be an enemy, right? And enemies are typically, the Russian government would assume that all journalists in the West hate them and write nasty things about them, right, in general.
Because we're told to.
Because we're told to by our CIA or whoever's in charge here or whatever. And so therefore we would not be targeted typically. And he was actually punished by essentially being kicked out of the country, and basically you're persona non grata in effect. In Russia. And so that's considered a major punishment for anybody who's an expert on Russia, because you can't go back. In theory, that means you can't be an expert. In theory, you can't write a best-selling book, So this punishment may have failed, but they did exact a punishment on him that was appropriate to the level of his...
And also that the level of abuse continues, so not just for me, but for everybody. I mean, I was at this conference on Friday in New York. It's called Putin Conference, organized by Garry Kasparov, the world chess player, who's a Russian opposition politician, who I used to write about when he was still in Moscow. But What's interesting is that he about 5 years ago, he decided to move to the US for his own safety. And the pool of Russian exiles who are opponents of the regime living abroad keeps getting smaller because they keep being killed. As well as Sergei Skripal, there was another Russian exile whom I knew and liked called Nikolai Glushkov. And on Friday, the British police announced he was found dead in his flat in London, that he'd been murdered. And the latest I read 2 hours ago, coming here, is that there was no sign of a forced entry. So he's
Would
been.
there be?
No, because it's KGB, and they're highly professional, and so it looks like two state assassinations of exiles within the space of 2 weeks, right on the eve of an election, with a huge international row, which has helped galvanize people to vote for Putin.
Go back in that a little bit more, because we sort of skipped over it, but I want to talk about what your interactions were, which sort of gets us into the collection of information about people, whether that's you or Donald Trump.
We're talking tapes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I was in Moscow with my wife Phoebe and our two small kids. We arrived in 2007, and as Mitch was saying, I mean, I think fairly early on I was sort of classified as an enemy, essentially because I was writing the kind of stories that journalists write all over the place. I was writing about Putin's wealth, which is a taboo. I was trying to get to the bottom of the Alexander Litvinenko murder, which had just happened, because as like now, relations were terrible between Moscow and London. And Litvinenko's 2 killers were still in Moscow. I met them both. And it was made pretty obvious that these kinds of stories were unwelcome. And we had a series of break-ins into our apartment done by the FSB, where they would move stuff around in a very stupid way and leave clues that you didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to find. I mean, they were all over the place. You know,
What do you do when something like that happens? Who do you call?
Well, you know, you don't call Ghostbusters. I mean, and that's a great question, because it's a moment of kind of, it's a cognitive problem, because in a normal country, if someone breaks into your apartment, you call the police. But if the state where you are has broken into your apartment, you can't call the state because they did it.
Lauren, can I add something here too?
Yeah.
Not only would Luke be treated this way, but our U.S. ambassador to Russia was treated this way.
Yeah, I mean, so what I was going to say was that so I went to the British Embassy and I said, I called my boss too. I said, look, we're getting these mysterious break-ins. And we went to a kind of secure room where we had to kind of check in all our mobiles. It looked like a music studio, and they basically said, this is the only room in the embassy which is not bugged. Everything else was compromised. And they said, it's the FSB, it's the spy agency. This is the worst kept diplomatic secret in Moscow, that they do these break-ins. They've been doing it since the sort of 60s and 70s, and the idea is to intimidate you. And I said, well, look, does that mean our flat is now bugged? And they said, yeah, it's bugged. And I said, well, could you get rid of the bugs? And they said, no. You know, first of all, you don't work for us, and secondly, they would just come back and replace them. And then I said, well, do they have video? And they said, yeah, they got video as well. In the bedroom, in the bedroom. Have a biscuit. You know, the British Embassy. I mean, you know, we're a post-imperial power, and now we're not so much, right? But you can always get a cup and tea and biscuit when you're in peril from the British ambassador. And the thing was, they made it obvious that they were watching us, because on one occasion they left a sex manual by the bed. We came back from a trip to Berlin, and next to all the novels that you wonderful educated people read was a sex manual in Russian, and they had bookmarked it to
In Russian?
Yeah, bookmarked it to a page on orgasms. And I was thinking, too conservative, or you know, frequency issue, or what is the message they're trying to send to me and my wife? And the thing was, you know, we've still got this, and we show it off at dinner parties. And on the one hand, it was kind of grimly funny. But on the other hand, we had no private space for 3.5 years. And whenever we wanted to have a kind of conversation, we would go and stand in the garden of our Moscow, outside our Moscow apartment, next to a very small plum tree. And the plum tree kind of came to signify for us private space. And the reason I tell you all this is that when we then had this gigantic conversation about what Donald Trump did or didn't do in 2013 at the Miss Universe beauty pageant. Now, the Steele dossier says that in the penthouse suite where Obama had stayed, that there were 2 prostitutes in the room, and they performed a show for him. Now, I don't know if there are 2 prostitutes in the room or not. Donald Trump will know, but Vladimir Putin will certainly know, because everybody in Moscow knows that the hotel would have been bugged, the suite would have been bugged, and indeed Trump would have been bugged, as indeed would other high-level visitors with sort of possibilities. So there will be a tape. No one tweeted this, but I'm told there are multiple tapes. And so then it's really a question of character, whether you think that Trump would have gone to bed and read a novel or not. But the FSB, KGB have been doing this forever. They did it to me. And they also, by the way, they would have done it when Trump first visited Moscow in the summer of 1987. Everything he said, he did, everyone he met would have been recorded and put in his file, which I think already by that period was quite large.
And would the interest at that point have been a business interest?
I think this is quite a key episode in my book. I think it would have been primarily an espionage interest from the Soviet side in Trump. And the reason I say that is, firstly, Trump was invited to Moscow by the Soviet government. Now, that doesn't happen to everybody. It tended to happen to sort of left-leaning writers and cultural figures like kind of Marquette or whatever who brought over. But the Soviet ambassador made a special trip up to Trump Tower, basically got to know Donald Trump, invited him. His travel was arranged by Intourist, which was the KGB, essentially, who kept tabs on who was allowed into Russia, into the Soviet Union, what they did there. And there's a kind of scholarly context, which was that we now know because the head of the KGB, someone called Vladimir Khrushchev, during this period in the mid-1980s, was sending furious top-secret memos to his KGB heads of station abroad, particularly in Washington and New York, saying that they were not doing enough to recruit Americans, that America remained the main target for the KGB. The phrase was glavny protivnik, glavny protivnik. And unlike a generation earlier in the 30s or even the 50s or 60s, where people had spied for the Soviet Union for ideological reasons, he was essentially saying that you've got to get more creative, you need to use money, and you need to look for upwardly mobile people in business and politics. So these were the memos which were flying around. And there was also, Khrushchev sent a personality questionnaire of the kind of person that the KGB was interested in cultivating for development purposes. That doesn't mean they become a spy, but that they're a target of interest. And essentially they were looking for people they were looking for flawed humans. And the list of characteristics they were looking for were vain, ambitious, narcissistic, a poor analyst, someone perhaps unfaithful in their marriage and prone to susceptible to advances from women. And I don't mean to sound partisan, but there's someone who kind of checks every single box here. And I think what we can say is that essentially he was sort of talent spotted and brought over. And then, of course, they would have taken a look at him and thought whether he was worth pursuing. But that 1987 trip had a really curious postscript, which is that about a month afterwards, Trump spent $100,000 on 3 full-page adverts criticizing Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. He was a real estate tycoon. He was not a geopolitician. He was not Kissinger. And yet he did this. And he also started talking about becoming president and having a kind of political career. Now, this may have been coalescing in his head separately. But I think essentially what has happened is that Moscow, both Soviet Moscow and Russian Moscow, have had a kind of on-off interest in Donald Trump, and which really escalated around about 2011, 2012, 2013. That's when they got re-keen on him at a time when Donald Trump was the most famous exponent of birtherism, which went down very well in Russia because Putin loathed Obama, detested Hillary Clinton, partly for reasons of misogyny, partly because he blamed her for anti-government protests in 2011, 2012. And there was a kind of quickening, in my view, during that period.
So how then, and that's a good example, that he came back and then there was this advertisement that sort of seemed to sort of spark this new chapter. Let's talk a little bit about collusion and the word collusion and the idea of collusion, which is still a question for the special counsel.
Yeah.
And something that you've put right on the top of your book. So make the argument.
Well, I mean, he also mentions it quite frequently.
Well,
I think that last time about 3 hours ago.
Yeah, there are some tweets. So, but how do you make that jump between individual actions, some of which may be for people's own self-interest, whether that's Michael Flynn and his own contracts, whether you're talking about the RNC and a plank inserted into a platform there. How do you make the leap between these individual things that happened and say you put them together and they are collusion? How do you make that leap?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've sort of seen Mueller's indictments. I mean, there will be more to come, but we have the predicate crime. We have the idea that there was a Russian espionage operation involving cyber, but also involving career spies to try and help Trump across the line. Most people accept that, including most Republicans. So the question is to what degree Donald Trump was cognizant of this. And I think Mitch's point, I mean, you can call it collusion, you can call it an understanding, but definitely the starting point for my book was trying to explain why Donald Trump is so nice about Putin when he was so rude about everybody else, including his own Republican Party rivals and the media and so on. And this theme continues. And I think we have the secret meetings that they're pretty well known about now. I mean, for a long time, the Trump campaign said there were no meetings with Russians. Now we know that essentially Russian intelligence operatives managed to penetrate the Trump campaign repeatedly with great ease. We have the famous meeting with Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort in Trump Tower with Natalia Veselnitskaya, who was a kind of Russian lawyer. We know that George Papadopoulos, foreign policy aide, was tipped off by a very strange Maltese professor called Joseph Mifsud in April 2016 that the Kremlin was sitting on a mountain of Democratic Party emails. This was at a time before anyone in the Democrats knew that there'd been a breach. And the interesting question now is who Papadopoulos told in the campaign, whether he told anybody. I think he did, and I think that Mueller knows he did.
Who do you think he told?
I'm not sure, but I'm confident of this. And so there's a sort of trail. And you just have to look at what sort of Trump was saying kind of publicly.
But do you think it was someone who was an official campaign person, or do you think it was someone who was on the periphery as an advisor?
I think it was someone official. And then you have Donald Trump that summer saying, Russia, if you're listening, why don't you give me the 30,000 emails? Where the hell are they? You know, that's practically the kind of subtext. And so they had to kind of jump on all of that. And then we have further meetings with Sergei Kislyak. We have Michael Flynn lying about it. We have Jared Kushner talking about setting up a special back channel and maybe even using Russian diplomatic facilities to talk to Moscow so that he's not going to be surveilled. This is not normal. This is not normal. You know, this is not usual behavior at all. And so clearly there are spies, there is cyber, there is a covert operation. I think the goal of this operation, basically Putin and Igor Sechin, other people in the Russian elite, thought that Hillary was going to win. So they didn't think Trump could make it. But what they wanted to do was to discredit Hillary from the beginning and have Trump, to suggest the election had been faked, and have Trump on TV news every night saying that she's a crook, she should be in jail. So this would be like he would be a stone in her shoe forever. That was the game plan. And of course Trump, to everyone's surprise, got across the line. And I think the best defense if you're Trump is not to say that none of this happened, because it did happen, but to just basically say, I'm an idiot. And I had no idea that these Russians bringing gifts were trying to help me, you know, whether it's hacked emails or intelligence or whatever. The problem is that his relationship with Russia goes back 3-4 decades. And it's primarily about money. I mean, the sex is one thing. I think the sex is survivable, but there's clearly an enormous amount of Russian money has gone into the Trump organization. I write in my book that sort of Trump's real estate business was essentially a laundromat for Russian money laundering. And hey, I haven't been sued.
Did you think,
I mean, we're in a room of lawyers.
Right?
Well, I mean, the book was very carefully lawyered. The problem is it can be proven. I mean, there were several Russian gangsters who lived in Trump Tower in the 80s and 90s who ended up in federal jail. There's one called Vyacheslav Ivankov who spent 3 years on the run from the FBI after getting out of prison, moving to Brighton Beach. And the FBI couldn't find him anyway. It turned out he'd been hiding in Trump Tower for 3 years. And he is a kind of classic underworld villain with the tattoos, the Chevron. I mean, he was eventually assassinated. He did 10 years in a federal penitentiary, repatriated to Moscow, and shot dead by a sniper in the center of Moscow 2 years later. So all of this is true. It can't really be denied. And even Donald Trump Jr. was saying, disproportionate number of our clients, this was in 2008, come from Russia. And it's interesting. I think it's the money that, I mean, we don't know how the story is going to end, but I think it's the money where Trump is most vulnerable, and he knows that.
And that's why I was asking you about sort of how things work in Russia, because it's important to understand that, to understand what you just said. One of the things that I still had so many questions, I mean, you read this book, certainly you read any of the indictments and you're going to have more questions. One of the things that I came away still having more questions about and wanting to know more about was the Trump Tower, Moscow potential there,
Yeah.
and the potential banking deals.
I mean, that's really interesting because so much of this, I mean, trying to write this book, is so much of the really key thing is timeline. As we're talking about Tillerson, the timeline is actually almost the most sort of revealing thing. But Trump was trying from 87 onwards to build a tower. He tried again in the 90s. It never happened. Then he has the Miss Universe beauty pageant, and he spends time with Aras Agalarov, who's a Russian oligarch who I know pretty well. I spent a day with Aras Agalarov, and he drove me around an estate he'd built for the Russian super rich, where it cost sort of $25 million for a house. And we were in his Mercedes. We were in his Jeep, but his bulletproof Mercedes was following 200 meters behind, and we were trundling along at about 20 kilometers an hour. This was the person that Trump was trying to partner with the Agalarovs. But what's really interesting is some of the emails that have now been released because of Mueller and because of the various House investigations are between Trump's underlings and Moscow. We have Felix Sater. He's just been on TV talking about this, emailing and saying that he'd secured financing from the Russian state bank VTB and another bank to build Trump Tower. Now, VTB in Moscow. VTB is a Russian state bank. It's run by someone called Andrei Kostin, who's the most powerful banker in Russia. He's ex-KGB. VTB it's the sort of banking division of Russian espionage. And they're the people buying the tower, who supposedly were going to fund the tower. And then you also have Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, emailing, incredibly, Dmitry Peskov, who's Putin's press spokesman, and another superlative cynic who speaks perfect English, saying, "Dear Mr. Peskov, our Trump Tower Moscow deal appears to have stalled. We're very grateful if you could assist." Now, these emails were only revealed by process of investigation, but they were contemporaneous with Trump saying on the stump, as candidate before he got the nomination, "Wouldn't it be great if we could get along with Russia? Vladimir Putin is a wonderful guy." And basically, round the back, they're trying to do business. And it's astonishing. Someone should write a book about it. I mean, it really is.
That brings us to the issue of sanctions and where they fall in this whole conversation. What impact are they having in Russia, and why are they such a focus?
Well, that's a long answer to that. The impact of sanctions. Some will argue in the academic literature that sanctions don't have that much impact, right? But I think
you think they do?
I think they do. I think that it's hard to see the impact. In other words, you could make an argument that the United States and the European Union has put economic sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Crimea, and look, they're still in Crimea, right? So what has it done? On the other hand, it hasn't caused them to pull out of Crimea. On the other hand, it has substantially reduced the pace of the Russian economy. Foreign direct investment, which was very high before sanctions, is much, much lower now, right? There was a huge rush of business interests in Russia in the years prior to sanctions, and now not so much. So I think it has hurt the Russian economy. Economists would estimate that it costs them, 0.5% of GDP or something like that per year, maybe 1%. But, it also has an impact. I mean, the number one policy priority for Putin's government, I think, maybe except for electing the president, would be to get rid of sanctions. That's presumably one of the reasons why they were trying to do it, right? And that's why Flynn was talking about sanctions with the Russian ambassador, because part of the deal was that they expected the Trump administration to get rid of sanctions, essentially. And that's because for them, they know that it's costing them billions of dollars a year. Maybe the estimates are $10, $20 billion a year per year in foreign investment that is forgone because of sanctions. So I think that it's fair to say that they think that sanctions are a really big deal. It's a top foreign policy priority. I think it is costing them quite a lot of money, and economic studies show that. So yes, I mean they are a really big deal. I actually wanted to ask though take in a slightly different question, because you're coming from Britain, right? And you're writing for Guardian, and you mentioned a bit Brexit now, and you mentioned that you wish that there were a Mueller investigation in Britain, which is something I wish too. But I'm very curious how much. Well, a couple questions. Why don't you think that Britain has launched an investigation? There's an Intelligence and Security Committee of the British Parliament that I understand has looked into this, but not made any of its findings public, for instance. And how much do you think is there, similar to this story? Is there anything there in the idea that Russia, with its money and the same sort of techniques and the same firms, Cambridge Analytica, which is in the news today,
Sure.
and the same techniques, that they're not only trying to run this operation in the United States, but they're also trying to run a very parallel, similar operation to support Brexit? And how much credence do you give that in the lack of information, official government information about it?
Yeah, I mean, they're great questions, sort of painful questions. Why the government has made more about it is because it's a very weak government. I mean, Theresa May had a good week last week, but generally she called an election, didn't win it, and is now relying on the support from a minority Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, and essentially she's been taken hostage by the fanatically pro-Brexit right wing of her own party, and this is not something that they want to talk about. I mean, the idea that Brexit might not be legitimate or may have been influenced in some way by Russia is, I mean, it's just, she just can't go there. I mean, I think my understanding is actually she has been briefed about this privately by the intelligence services who've said that yes, there was a Russian operation, certainly featuring social media, certainly featuring the kind of things we saw in the US election of 2016. Again, there's a question of whether that was determinant or not, which ultimately is unknowable. But there's also a kind of parallel question about funding. That the people who funded Brexit, primarily someone called Aaron Banks, who has a Russian wife, which is not a crime, but also has extensive business interests which are opaque. They're all structured through offshore companies, which is the favorite way of kind of doing this kind of thing. And he is fantastically active on Twitter. He says that anyone who suggests that there's a Russian connection is a kind of maniac liberal conspiracy theorist who should put a tin hat on. But I think there are sort of genuine kind of questions about that. I've talked to Russian journalists in Moscow who are skeptical about this and say that there was money set aside for Brexit, but it got stolen. So I think, but what we do need is we need to be transparent about it, and we don't have the mechanism. We don't have a special counsel, but it's certainly something I've been looking at and that I'm still looking at, and I don't think we have an answer to it yet because what Russia has been doing everywhere, it's not just the US, has been trying to kind of push the dial to tilt things all across Europe, and also to essentially support the far left and the far right, who seem to agree on Russia. I mean, it's quite amazing. You had Jeremy Corbyn basically casting doubt on whether the Russians were behind the Skripal attack. But then you have Nigel Farage. I don't know if people know who Nigel Farage is,
Yeah, we
but
do.
he's an extremely irritating individual who also runs around America making kind of pro-Trump, pro-Russian comments, and was also even giving speeches in favor of Californian secessionism, which turned out to be a project that someone came up with in Siberia. And there are, I mean, we did a story in The Guardian saying that Farage was a person of interest in the Mueller investigation. And I think he is, because he is the person who links the Team Trump and Julian Assange, who leaked all of these emails out, which were hacked by Russian intelligence. Mm-hmm. And if you're looking for a go-between, you end up with Nigel. Mm-hmm. I mean, he grins all the time, and I mean, he's not quite as bad as Carter Page in that respect, but he does a lot of grinning. And the danger is you don't take him seriously, but I think he is playing a very dangerous game.
You also published in The Guardian an article which showed that Nigel Farage, who was the head of the UK Independence Party, and he was the one who really got Brexit on the agenda.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the reason it was even considered was probably because of him, largely.
That's correct.
And he was traveling with a guy named George Cottrell, who was his personal campaign assistant. And Cottrell in 2016 was arrested in Chicago by the FBI and charged with money laundering.
I really want someone to leak me some information about that. In fact, you leak me anything. But it's the most bizarre incident, and it squares with other stuff which I can't go into because I can't verify it. But that we've heard about possible financial operations in America involving these people.
But that's right, that if there were a go-between, these would probably be a top candidate.
Yeah.
And I know we have to get on to your questions. I want to wrap up this segment by asking you one more quick thing,
Sure.
which is what one question you want answered? Is there one interaction or one...
Are you talking of Trump or in general?
On Trump. Yeah,
I'm asking Trump and he tells the truth, or
you don't
I'm
have
asking...
to ask Trump. You don't have to ask Trump. It could be.
He's not strapped down with a truth drug.
It could be an interaction that Paul Manafort has. It could be about the Trump Tower meeting with Trump Jr. Is there one answer that you think if we got that one answer, you would really know the truth?
Well, there's one thing I really want to see, actually, I can answer it like that, is that, and probably it no longer exists in physical form, but I would love to see Trump's KGB file, because it will be extensive. It will include stuff sent to Moscow by Czech spies, Czechoslovak spies, who we know from declassified records in Prague spied on Donald and Ivana Trump in Manhattan in the 1980s and had chats with his father-in-law. But I'm pretty certain that my sort of thesis of this kind of historical attempts to cultivate him, which quite often didn't go anywhere and then resumed subsequently, I think it's right. But the file, if it exists, would tell us.
Would you believe everything in it?
Well, it depends on what the circumstances were. If were it to be released now, it would be deliberately faked. But in your kind of platonic scenario,
Yes.
I would love to read that, because I think what it would show is a big operation, and also I'd quite like to map some of the people who wrote these reports with Russian diplomats who all died in a big flurry mysteriously around the time of the dossier. I mean, I write about them, but there were about 10, 12 diplomats, security officers. One fell off the roof of the consulate in New York. I don't know how they would mesh, but just lastly on this, there's someone I greatly admire. There's a historian and a writer, English writer called Timothy Garton Ash, and he was a student of Eastern Europe who lived in East Berlin in the 1980s, and when the Berlin Wall came down, he found his Stasi file from the East German secret police. They'd been spying on him. And he discovered that they had given him the code name Romeo and had spied on him with girlfriends that he'd forgotten about. And he wrote a book called The File, which is a wonderful meditation on history, on the Cold War, on mutability, on our younger selves versus our older selves. and he goes and sees the people who spied on him. And you know, if I'm not on my Zimmer frame, you know, and if the Putin regime goes down, I would love to see the Trump file, and I would love to see the file on me.
So why don't we go ahead and open it up to questions, the floor is open.
So all this stuff is sort of embellishing things that we've been reading in the paper, and it's fascinating, it's ugly, it's brutal. But the question is, how do Western democracies mount an effective battle against this? Because this is a war without nuclear weapons, without javelin missiles.
Why don't we pitch that to
And in that context, I'd like to ask about sort of one of the obvious steps that the English government could take and hasn't, which is to really act against the assets of the Russian oligarchs in London and kick out their children from the private English schools, and really make it clear that if you want to participate in Western liberal democracy, you can't spend your time doing your best to undermine it.
Do you want to talk to the big point, and I'll talk to the English point?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think it's a great question. A lot of people have to ask themselves right now, and I think the good news about it is there's a lot of simple steps like the one you mentioned, right? In other words, the biggest issue right now that's happening is that the West simply isn't responding at all, right? It took a long time even for the president to acknowledge that Skripal was killed by the Russians, right? Or that this was a Russian operation, right? So what's effectively happening is we're not doing anything at all. But I think what you suggest in Britain is one of the important steps, right? Is that where the money goes, the money laundering that's happening, it's happening because of developers in New York, you know, like Donald Trump, who are money laundering, you know, maybe with their own knowledge, you know, for the Russians. And many U.S. banks and many British banks are engaged in that. A big part of their profits is based on this operation. And so, you know, that's like bad news in some ways, but it's also good news in that there's really relatively straightforward steps that one could take to deal with this. And the issue with the covert action is that Russia has tried to bring us into a world where we don't know. That's why it's so disturbing when people say, oh, we don't know really if it's true or not, you know, we're not sure, because that demobilizes you. It makes it impossible to take the obvious few steps that would be required to deal with this.
I mean, I would just add that is our best weapon is leverage, because, like I said, this is a post-ideological regime. All they ultimately care about are their billions and hanging on to their billions, and they are completely different from the sort of Soviet apparatchiks of 50 years ago, who would have a nice Moscow flat with a slightly higher ceiling and a car, and would holiday in Bulgaria or in Sochi. I mean, these are people with private planes, with yachts, with mistresses, with kids who go to British or American universities, with properties in the south of France, in London, in New York. And they like being part of the kind of international super elites. And so personal sanctions against people at the top of the Kremlin, I mean, there are some already, but they're still relatively modest, and against their kids, and against Kremlin officials more generally, would be supremely effective, because it wouldn't hurt ordinary Russians. We have to be very clear that I mean, Putin has become this kind of bogeyman, but he is not Russia. I mean, it's a great country. There are great Russians in there who are victims of this system, and who are decent and want the same things that we all want. So I think we have to go after the money. And what's interesting about Theresa May is that thus far she's kicked out some diplomats and has been rhetorically tough, but she hasn't done any of the things that might help, like, for example, de-anonymizing house buying in London. I mean, London is really a kind of kleptocrat central, and all of these, I can't afford to live in London, even though I've got a best-selling book, you know, because all of these kleptocrats have bought these properties for huge sums of money. And there are areas of the West, in West London, Knightsbridge, Belgravia, where you go around there in the evening and there are no lights on, because there's no one actually living there. It's like a sort of safe deposit box for crooks, for international crooks, who buy these properties using offshore vehicles. And so one very practical measure she could do is to end this kind of anonymity, The problem is, as Mitch was saying, there are British lawyers, there are American lawyers, there are accountants who've got very rich from servicing these clients. So I think we need to recognize that this problem is a political problem, but it's also a problem of corruption inside our own societies, and we just need to be much tougher on it.
Disappointed to learn I won't be moving to London anytime soon.
Let me say first that I'm really enjoying your book. I'm listening to it, though, not reading it.
Okay.
You raise in your book the relationship with Carter Page and the possible sale of Gazprom and the offer that was made to him of 19% or so of the brokerage of the sale, which is like the number of billions is off the wall. You also raise the specter of the Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah.
And whether Trump actually is or his establishment is, hasn't Putin really succeeded with the destabilization, the polarization, not just of the United States, but through Brexit, if there is, and who would think that there isn't an involvement, there too. How does he lose? He's the ultimate chess player.
Yeah, I think Putin thinks that this is, people talk about a new Cold War, but for Putin, I think it didn't stop. It was merely that there was a period of historical weakness in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, where Russia was indebted and kind of an economic kind of mess. And for him, this is a continuation of the Cold War in a sort of post-communist era, using these measures I was talking about, using active measures to try and subvert Western democracy and exploit its porousness. And one thing he's been very clever at is that I think to understand sort of Putin's gambit, we have to be clear. He is not sort of Batman in a cave, flicking switches, red switches, and then something happens in Philadelphia or in Texas or wherever. He is an opportunist with a playbook that worked during the Cold War that he is using, but just updated with cyber and with other kind of modern capabilities. And so, in this country, Putin did not author the sort of upswell of populist nativist feeling against the establishment, against Wall Street, which may or may not have cost Hillary the election. But what he tried to do was instrumentalize it and to push people to the extremes. And we know from the Steele dossier that he was very keen to push, Moscow was very keen to push Bernie, very keen to push Jill Stein, who, of course, together with Michael Flynn, was wooed by Moscow and took part in this kind of gala in 2015, and very keen to push Donald Trump. And so, essentially, he's trying to subvert things, and the KGB tried in the 1980s against Reagan. It was entirely hopeless. But the world is so precarious at the moment and so dark that he is exploiting these very powerful forces, which are also in Europe as well. And I would say if this is a Cold War, he's winning it.
Mitch, do you want to follow up on that? Can you tell us something about the French elections, attempts to intervene in the German elections, potentially Dutch elections, Italian elections?
Yeah, I mean,
what's going on?
it's interesting. This book is, of course, focused on the United States. Of course, very great interest, to the U.S. market. How's it selling in Britain, by the way?
Oh, it's doing okay. It's doing okay everywhere.
But the fact is that, as your question implies, we could be talking about the same thing happening in so many different countries, right? And the U.S. debate typically ignores that, right? And in a way, maybe if I were to suggest in your next version, one of the nice things to do would be to do a little bit of comparative work, right?
Sure.
Because for the U.S. market, it's not widely perceived that this exact same playbook is playing out in different. So part of the reason, Lauren, that people are very, concerned about what's happening in the United States is because we can see it's the same playbook that's happening in Italy, or that's happening in France, or that's happening in Moldova, or it's happening in Ukraine, or it's happening in Germany.
Are they responding differently to it in terms of how they are changing their election systems or trying to protect themselves? Are they responding differently to it than we are here in the US?
I think every country is responding very differently. I think Britain is probably weaker response, frankly,
Weaker than the US?
Than the U.S. As you discussed, they don't even have a Mueller investigation. So the likelihood is in Britain, we're never going to know about what happened with Brexit until way too late. In Germany has been interesting. Their parliament was hacked. They got all their emails stolen, essentially, out of the parliament. The Russians had gotten inside the parliamentary servers. Because, by the way, they couldn't get inside government servers. They tried to get inside the government servers. They're too protected. So they went into the parliamentary servers and managed to download all the emails of the Christian Democratic Party. And interestingly, they didn't leak them because I think Germany put up a much stiffer cyber response. And I think the Russians, frankly, were probably worried that Germany was going to go after them. You notice that the NSA chief was asked in a Senate hearing recently, do you have the go-ahead to respond? And he said, no, we don't, because we haven't been given authorization for offensive operations, right? So in other words, the best way probably cyber warfare to respond to this is to make them feel like if they do it to you, you're going to do it to them. Right? If you don't have the authorization, why not do it? But Germany apparently was able to threaten them enough that they decided not to leak their things. Macron in France, who won his presidential election, despite being attacked by Russian trolls and Russian media, was very clear in his campaign. He actually called out the Kremlin, the Russia Today and Sputnik, their news outlets, and said, look, you're not news organizations. You're propaganda organizations, and I won't have you in my campaign entourage. You're not going to be on my plane.
Yeah.
You're not going to be traveling with me. And when he won, and Putin actually visited France shortly thereafter, he called out Putin at the podium. He was standing at the podium with Putin and said, we will not tolerate this type of propaganda effort, blah, blah, blah.
And also the funding of Marine Le Pen.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Are
Right. I mean,
candidates in all of these countries.
exactly, which, in other words, they're doing the same kinds of things, but definitely different governments are responding kind of differently. And I think there are some good examples there that people are looking at.
Let's get another question in here.
Do you think that Putin will move away from Trump as he becomes more of a liability and more of this is exposed? What will it take for him to go, done with that?
I think if Trump starts misbehaving, if he goes off script.
That will
Yeah.
all
I mean,
the exposure-
let's say Trump starts criticizing Vladimir Putin personally, which we haven't seen so far, then Putin is in the exquisite position that he can perhaps leak some previously unknown details of Trump's cooperation, or maybe not Trump, but people around him, or Jared, or whatever. And that's the great thing. He can turn the pressure up, or he can turn it down, depending on his sort of strategic need.
So that's the only liability is that, Trump's loyalty to him.
You still have to, even if you accept there was, if you sort of say the collusion thing is all rubbish, it's all fake, it's all a witch hunt, et cetera, you still have to explain why Trump appears to be slightly terrified of Putin, in a way that other leaders are not. The fact that he refuses to criticize him, even when we have a nerve agent attack, for goodness sake, in the United Kingdom, he won't say anything about Putin. I mean, part of this, I think, is a conspiracy, a sort of Russian conspiracy with an American kind of component, which I try and tell in my book, like a thriller. But part of it is in plain sight.
Can I add to that? I think one of the big misconceptions, right, in a way, is that Putin was trying to help Trump because somehow he likes Trump. That's not really it.
I'm
What it was
sure he
was-
thinks he's an idiot.
What it was that he was trying to use him to destabilize American
Yeah.
politics.
And I'm asking, when does he cease to be useful?
But I mean, sorry, just to follow on from that. I mean, the point is, what I keep on trying to stress, this is a bipartisan issue, because next time it might be a Democrat. I mean, there's nothing saying, Putin will always favor Republicans. He will favor whatever he needs in a particular country at a particular time. So it could be Jeremy Corbyn next time in the UK, who's someone from the sort of far left. So it's nothing to do with politics. It's to do with what maximizes Russia's advantage.
We've talked, or you folks
You
have
could
talked
speak
about,
up a little bit.
yes, you've mentioned interference with democracies, revenge, murder, and does any of this begin to have us look a little bit differently possibly at the Smolensk crash?
Oh, you're talking about the Polish president being wiped out?
And most of his government and most of
Yeah, I'm funny enough. I was interesting. For those of you who don't remember, President Kaczynski was killed when trying to land his plane in Smolensk in pretty. It was foggy, but the circumstances have never been kind of properly clarified. I don't know. I mean, it's possible. It's
not forgetting the Kaczynski going to Georgia and standing.
Yeah, I mean, everything is possible. One of the people I saw when I was at this sort of Putin conference on Friday in New York was Alex Goldfarb, and Alex Goldfarb was best friends with Alexander Litvinenko, and helped smuggle him out of Russia to London, where he got political asylum. And I famously remember Alex giving evidence in the High Court about the case. And he said, I used to think that Alexander was paranoid, and then now I realize he was right to be paranoid, given everything else that has happened. In other words, his friend was murdered with a cup of tea, radioactive cup of tea. Yeah. So I think we're right to be paranoid, but we should also kind of keep calm and remain cheerful, hard though it seems, and remain evidential.
Let me just say we're going to have a reception at 6 o'clock in 5 minutes, and I want to direct you to that, which will be out this door, turn right, and go up the stairs to what's called the clock area. And I'm sure our speakers will be willing to answer further questions. Why don't we get on 2 more quick questions? We can ask one after the other, and then why don't we do 1, 2, and then we'll invite our panelists to answer and continue the discussion in the clock area. Now?
We learned last week that the Russians have gotten into our power grids and some of our nuclear energy and other things that could certainly turn the lights off in the United States. Was this something that you saw happening, and how would you interpret this in view of everything else that's going on?
Okay.
Let's take 1 more question, then we'll answer them both.
Beyond the current administration, what do the Russians have on members of Congress?
Huh. I would love to know, and again, if anyone can leak me anything on that, then. So on infrastructure, they did it in Ukraine. Previously, there was a massive cyber attack, and at one point, Moscow shut down power in the middle of the winter for 70,000 people in Kiev, and basically, it's mind games. It's saying we can strike you just like this, and the idea is to spook everybody, and I think it's quite effective, actually. I mean, probably they won't do it, but they're saying we can do it. What have they got on members of Congress? I don't know, but what I can tell you is that Christopher Steele in recent months from Grassley, from Nunes, has come under ferocious attack. They've described him as a kind of political hack, as a kind of left-wing conspiracist, as an agitator, and it's deeply unfair. It's not true. I mean, he's a tough guy. He can kind of take care of himself, but he can't defend himself publicly against this. And I don't understand their logic, because at some point Trump will fall. I mean, maybe he does 8 years. I think that's unlikely. But you sort of sense that they will be in absolutely the kind of wrong place. And whether they're doing it from conviction or for other reasons, I don't know. But it's a great question.
I have different answers to both those questions. I would say, first of all, on the cyber attack issue, or on the breaking down of public utilities, first thing when I read that, first of all, it's not news. It's been known to all sort of experts on resilience for quite some time, and experts on cyber warfare, that Russia has a lot of capabilities in this area, including, and we're very, very poorly protected in our infrastructure. And there's a lot of people who have been thinking about it. Again, not an area where a lot has been done, but there have been efforts to try and deal with that. One of the principles of cyber warfare is, again, mutual assured destruction. So part of the reason that some people are less worried about it, we don't think Russia's going to do it tomorrow, is we can also do it to them, most likely. On the question of members of Congress, I think that one of the reasons, it's very puzzling to me that a lot of Republicans, senators and congressmen, who you hear from time to time speaking out in favor of the Mueller investigation, for instance, Trey Gowdy, for instance, Lindsey Graham, for instance, John McCain, many others. It's widely known, there's a lot of Republicans who are very concerned about this, and yet they don't seem to really act a lot of the time. And I think one of the key reasons is that, that there are, in fact, the Russian money didn't just go to Trump. So just as a, for instance, the Federal Election Commission initiated an investigation this week of the National Rifle Association, which spent a lot more money on this campaign than on previous ones. It spent triple the money it had spent on previous campaigns. And they're being investigated right now for whether that money didn't come from Russia. I think you'll find that a lot of other Republican organizations, as well as Jill Stein's campaign, were financed in part, got money from Russia in different ways. And we should always keep in mind that on the social media side of things, they were funding this fake Tennessee GOP organization. Anybody read about that? 10 GOP. They were also financing Black Lives Matter, a Black Lives Matter, thing. So I think that part of the reason that a lot of people are not interested in investigating this is because they're worried just how far this goes.
And that Russian hacking of the RNC in addition to the DNC?
Well, that apparently everybody acknowledges that did happen. What they're doing with that again, they're holding that. But I think the question is that there are people who are conscious that this money crept into their campaign and into their coffers too. And for that reason, they don't want to see a whole lot of their political buddies go down for this.
Please join me in thanking